You stand at the heart of medieval Europe, a world seemingly as eternal and unyielding as the stone castles that dotted its landscape. For centuries, you have lived under a system where land was power, loyalty was currency, and your place in the grand tapestry of existence was determined at birth. This was feudalism, a complex web of duties and allegiances that bound kings to nobles, nobles to knights, and knights to the vast, toiling masses of peasantry. It was, you are told, the divine order of things. You watch the sunrise over the Lord's manor, its fields stretching out under a hazy morning sky. Your family, like generations before you, works this land, producing enough to sustain yourselves and a portion for your Lord, who in turn offers protection. It's a life of hard labor, simple pleasures, and constant awareness of your subservience. You see the knights in their gleaming armor, symbols of the martial prowess that kept your village safe from raiders, and the priest, a beacon of spiritual comfort in an often brutal world. But beneath this seemingly unbreakable order, whispers begin to stir. Not of rebellion, not yet, but of change. Subtle shifts in the very earth you tread. Faint tremors that will, over centuries, fracture the bedrock of feudal society. You perceive these changes not as sudden cataclysms, but as a slow, inexorable drift, much like the relentless carving of a river through rock. One of the first, most fundamental changes occurs in the very act of working the land. For generations, crude wooden plows merely scratched the surface of the soil. But you see the introduction of a new tool, the heavy, iron-tipped moldboard plow. It cuts deeper, turning the earth more efficiently, aerating it, and leading to richer harvests. Suddenly, the land that once yielded meager returns begins to offer more. Coupled with this technological marvel, you witness the spread of the three-field system. Instead of leaving half your land fallow each year, now only a third rests. More crops, more variety, wheat, rye, oats, beans. This agricultural revolution, though slow and unsung, is a game changer. You feel the tangible difference. Bellies are fuller, children are stronger, and fewer succumb to the cruel grip of starvation. With more food comes more life. You see your village grow, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. More children survive infancy. More adults live to old age. The population of Europe, stagnant for centuries, begins an unprecedented boom. This might seem like a blessing, and in many ways it is, but it also strains the old systems. More people mean more mouths to feed, yes, but also more hands, more minds, and eventually, more demands. As the population swells, the traditional manorial system, designed for smaller, self-sufficient communities, begins to creak under the pressure. There's less land per family, competition for resources, and a growing sense of restlessness. The communal bonds, once so strong, fray slightly under the weight of sheer numbers and growing individual aspirations. Then, a new phenomenon begins to emerge on the edges of your world: the rise of towns and cities. At first, they are mere market settlements, crossroads where merchants gather to exchange goods. But as trade routes revive, fueled by excess agricultural production and a growing population, these settlements begin to flourish. You hear tales of bustling streets, skilled artisans, and opportunities far removed from the dusty fields of your manor. You imagine a young peasant, perhaps a younger brother with no land to inherit, drawn by the distant murmur of commerce. He slips away from the manor, leaving behind the familiar routines, the oppressive authority of the Lord, and the promise of endless toil. He seeks something new, a life where his labor might earn him more than just sustenance and protection. In these burgeoning towns, a new class begins to take shape: the burghers, the merchants, the artisans. These individuals are not tied to the land. Their wealth comes not from feudal dues, but from skill, trade, and enterprise. You see them as figures of both envy and suspicion, their fine clothes and independent spirit a stark contrast to the rough garments and subservient demeanor of the peasantry. The growth of towns creates a powerful magnetic pull. They offer freedom, often after a year and a day of living within town walls. A serf could claim freedom from their lord. This is a revolutionary concept, a crack in the very foundation of the feudal hierarchy. You envision the hope, the fear, and the sheer audacity of leaving everything you know behind for an uncertain future in a crowded, noisy, and potentially dangerous city. The increasing trade also necessitates a shift in the economy. Barter, the exchange of goods for goods, begins to recede, replaced by the re-emergence of coinage. You feel the weight of silver and gold in your hand, a new kind of power, portable and universally accepted. Lords, once content with labor and produce, now increasingly demand payment in coin. This forces peasants to sell their surplus, integrating them further into a cash economy they barely understand. This shift to a money economy has profound implications for feudal lords. Instead of relying solely on the loyalty and service of their vassals, knights, they can now hire professional soldiers, mercenaries. You see the grim faces of these paid fighters, their allegiance to gold rather than land. This begins to erode the very purpose of feudal vassalage, rendering the traditional feudal levy less essential. The knight, once indispensable, now faces competition. Royal authority, too, begins to subtly reassert itself. Kings, once mere figures at the top of a decentralized feudal pyramid, start to see an opportunity. With money from taxes on trade and towns, they can now afford to build their own standing armies, rather than relying solely on the whims of their unruly nobles. You sense the shift in power, slowly, almost imperceptibly, flowing away from the local lord and towards the distant but increasingly powerful monarch. The very nature of warfare also begins to evolve. Sieges become more complex, requiring sophisticated engines and organized labor. The individual prowess of a knight, though still valued, is increasingly overshadowed by the need for larger, well-funded, and centrally commanded forces. You feel the ground shake as new, more destructive weapons are slowly introduced, hinting at an end to the dominance of the heavily armored cavalry. The age of the lone knight, the backbone of feudal military might, is already beginning to wane. You now witness events unfolding on a much grander scale, beyond the familiar confines of your village and manor. The distant, thunderous call of the Crusades echoes across Europe. At first, they are a spiritual fervor, a rallying cry to reclaim the Holy Land. But their impact on the fabric of feudal society proves to be far more complex and enduring than mere religious zeal. You see nobles, full of piety and ambition, mortgaging their lands, selling off their possessions, and borrowing heavily to fund their expeditions to the east. For many, it is an opportunity for glory, salvation, or new lands. But for others, it's a financial gamble that often leads to ruin. Their long absences leave power vacuums, and their need for coin accelerates the shift to a money-based economy, forcing them to sell rights and freedoms to peasants and nascent towns. The returning crusaders, those who survive, bring back more than just tales of distant lands. They return with new ideas, new goods, and a broader worldview. You see silks, spices, and exotic crafts, stimulating further trade and the growth of urban centers. More importantly, they bring back a different perspective on learning, exposed to the advanced scholarship of the Islamic world, sparking intellectual curiosity that slowly begins to challenge the rigid scholasticism of Western Europe. Education, once almost exclusively confined to monasteries, begins to spread beyond their walls. You feel the burgeoning energy of new universities, first in Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Scholars, not always churchmen, gather to debate philosophy, law, and medicine. The emphasis shifts, however subtly, from rote memorization of dogma to critical inquiry. This intellectual awakening, fueled by rediscovered Greek and Roman texts and new ideas from the East, begins to foster independent thought, a dangerous seed in a society built on unquestioning obedience. Imagine a young, ambitious scholar, perhaps of common birth but sharp mind, who through sheer intellect finds a path to influence, a path previously reserved for those born into nobility or the church. You sense the growing power of ideas, a force that cannot be defeated by a knight's sword or a lord's decree. Yet, even as society evolves, the forces of nature remind you of humanity's vulnerability. You feel a creeping chill in the air. The summers grow shorter, the rains more frequent, the harvests less bountiful. This is the beginning of what historians will call the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic deterioration that will wreak havoc on an already strained agricultural system. You witness years of failed crops, a return of the gnawing hunger that had slowly receded. Famines sweep across Europe, weakening populations, making them susceptible to disease. The fragile gains in population and prosperity begin to reverse. The common folk, already at the mercy of their lords, now face the unforgiving wrath of nature. And then, a cataclysm unlike any ever witnessed. You hear the whispers of a terrible plague, traveling swiftly from the east. It arrives first in the bustling port cities, then spreads inland with terrifying speed, carried by rats and fleas, or perhaps something more insidious, more pervasive. You feel the terror, the desperation, as it sweeps through your village, indiscriminately claiming lord and serf, rich and poor. This is the Black Death. You see its devastating work. Villages decimated, fields lying fallow, entire families wiped out. Within a few short years, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population perishes. The sheer scale of death is incomprehensible, leaving behind a landscape of grief, fear, and unimaginable emptiness. The immediate aftermath is chaos, but from this devastation emerges an unexpected and profound shift in power. With so many dead, the surviving peasants, once an endless and easily replaceable labor force, suddenly find themselves in high demand. You feel the stirrings of a new kind of power, a power born of scarcity. Lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, are forced to make concessions. You see them offering better wages, lighter rents, and even granting freedoms to entice laborers to work their fields. The old feudal dues, labor service on the Lord's domain, become less desirable and less enforceable. Peasants, who once clung to the land, now have options, a newfound leverage they never dreamed possible. This newfound bargaining power gives rise to widespread social unrest. You hear the angry shouts of peasants, emboldened by their numbers and the realization of their worth. Revolts erupt across Europe. The Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England. You witness the burning of manors, the defiance of authority, as the common folk demand an end to serfdom and feudal obligations. Though often brutally suppressed, these revolts leave an indelible mark. They demonstrate the fragility of the feudal system, proving that the established order could be challenged, and that the collective will of the common people, once dismissed, could be a formidable force. The fear of another uprising lingers, forcing lords to reconsider their absolute authority. Simultaneously, a quiet revolution in weaponry is taking place, one that will further erode the military dominance of the feudal knight. You hear the deafening roar of crude cannons and the whistle of arrows from longbows. Gunpowder, a Chinese invention, slowly makes its way into European warfare. You sense the shift in the battlefield. Castles, once impregnable symbols of feudal power, become vulnerable to cannon fire. The longbow, particularly in the hands of disciplined English archers, proves devastating against heavily armored knights, as seen in the battles of Crécy and Poitiers. These new technologies make warfare more accessible to commoners trained in their use, diminishing the exclusive military role of the knight and highlighting the value of infantry over cavalry. The age of individual chivalric combat begins to give way to organized, technologically driven armies. This transformation in warfare also plays a crucial role in the emergence of stronger nation-states. You see kings, now with access to professional armies equipped with new weapons, able to project their power over wider territories, challenging the fragmented authority of their feudal lords. The 100 Years' War, a protracted conflict between England and France, becomes a crucible for these changes. You witness the grinding attrition of this war, spanning over a century, draining the resources of both kingdoms but also forging a nascent sense of national identity. Peasants, fighting alongside other commoners, begin to identify less as vassals of a local lord and more as Englishmen or Frenchmen. This shared experience of warfare, often brutal and prolonged, contributes to a collective consciousness that transcends purely feudal allegiances. The immense cost of these protracted wars forces monarchs to seek new sources of revenue, further empowering the growing merchant class and urban centers through taxation and loans. You perceive the delicate balance of power shifting as kings become increasingly reliant on the wealth generated by trade and commerce, rather than solely on agricultural output and feudal obligations. The old system is being hollowed out from within and without. The very concept of land as the sole determinant of wealth and power begins to unravel. While still important, the growing importance of coin, trade, and even education means that power can now be acquired through new avenues, not just inherited titles or military service to a lord. You feel the walls of the old order crumbling brick by brick under the weight of these profound and multifaceted changes. The once clear-cut social hierarchy, based on those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, becomes increasingly blurred. A wealthy merchant, though not noble by birth, might wield more economic power than a minor baron. A skilled artisan in a thriving town might live a life of greater comfort and freedom than a struggling serf. The absolute rigidity of the feudal class structure is beginning to give way to a more fluid, albeit still unequal, society. You feel a new wind blowing across Europe, not just of chilling air, but of invigorating ideas. After the devastation of the Black Death and the long, brutal wars, a reawakening begins. It is the Renaissance, a fervent rediscovery of classical art, literature, and philosophy. You sense the shift in human thought, moving away from purely theological explanations and embracing human potential, reason, and individual achievement. This intellectual and artistic flourishing, initially centered in the wealthy city-states of Italy, slowly permeates the rest of the continent. You witness masterpieces of art, architecture, and literature emerging, celebrating the human form and spirit in ways that would have been deemed sacrilegious centuries prior. The focus shifts from the divine to the human, from the communal to the individual. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, becomes a revolutionary force. You feel the tactile sensation of paper and ink, the power of words rapidly duplicated and disseminated. No longer is knowledge the exclusive domain of scribes and monasteries. Books, once rare and precious, become more accessible. Ideas, once confined to small intellectual circles, now spread like wildfire. This unprecedented spread of literacy and information has profound implications. You see common people, even some peasants, gaining access to texts, learning to read and beginning to question the established order with newfound confidence. The Church's monopoly on knowledge, a cornerstone of its authority, and an integral part of the feudal system's moral fabric, begins to erode under the weight of this intellectual democratization. Imagine the quiet rebellion of a villager, poring over a printed pamphlet, questioning a sermon, or discussing new scientific findings with a neighbor. The unchallenged narratives that sustained the feudal hierarchy for centuries suddenly face scrutiny. You perceive the subtle cracking of ancient certainties, replaced by a yearning for understanding and truth. Almost simultaneously, the horizons of your world dramatically expand. The age of exploration begins. You hear the creaking of great wooden ships, the flapping of sails in the wind, as bold navigators venture into unknown oceans. They seek new trade routes, new lands, and new riches. The lure of gold, spices, and exotic goods proves irresistible, driving unparalleled maritime ventures. You witness the discovery of the Americas, a continent teeming with unimagined wealth and resources. Gold and silver begin to flow back to Europe in astonishing quantities. This influx of precious metals injects a massive boost into the burgeoning money economy, further devaluing land as the sole measure of wealth and power. The establishment of vast colonial empires creates new trade networks, globalizing the economy in ways previously inconceivable. You see new commodities, potatoes, corn, tobacco, reshaping diets and economies across Europe. The focus of wealth shifts from localized agricultural production to international commerce and resource extraction. With the rise of overseas trade and colonial ventures, the merchant class, already empowered by the growth of towns, accumulates immense fortunes. You feel the growing influence of these powerful merchant families, their wealth rivaling and often exceeding that of the traditional landed nobility. They demand political influence commensurate with their economic power, challenging the old aristocratic order. This era also marks the emergence of early forms of capitalism and mercantilism, economic theories that prioritize national wealth through trade, accumulation of bullion, and colonial exploitation. You observe monarchs actively supporting these ventures, seeing them as a means to fill royal coffers, strengthen their armies, and further consolidate their power against unruly feudal lords. Then, another seismic shift, this one in the spiritual realm. The Protestant Reformation. You hear the thunderous pronouncements of Martin Luther, challenging the authority of the Pope and the doctrines of the Catholic Church. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door, sparks a continent-wide spiritual upheaval. You witness the fracturing of Christendom as new Protestant denominations emerge. Kings, eager to break free from papal interference and seize church lands and wealth, often support these reforms. This weakens the moral and political authority of the Pope, who had long sanctioned the feudal order and acted as a supreme arbiter across Europe. The Reformation's emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture and a direct relationship with God further erodes the hierarchical structures that underpinned both church and state. You see the spread of individual conscience, questioning the rigid obedience demanded by feudal lords and bishops alike. These combined forces, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the Reformation, act as powerful solvents on the remaining bonds of feudalism. Landed estates, once the sole source of power, now compete with commercial wealth. Local loyalties give way to national identities. Spiritual subservience to Rome is replaced by diverse religious expressions. The monarchs, strategically aligning themselves with the rising merchant class and leveraging the new wealth from trade and colonies, continue to centralize power. You see the slow, deliberate construction of modern nation-states, with professional bureaucracies, tax systems, and standing armies loyal to the crown, not to a collection of independent lords. The feudal contract, once a binding agreement of mutual obligation between lord and vassal, becomes increasingly anachronistic. The king no longer needs to rely on his nobles for military service. He can hire soldiers. The lord no longer relies solely on serf labor. He can hire free peasants or derive income from rents in a money economy. In many parts of Western Europe, serfdom itself gradually disappears. You hear the joyous, if sometimes uncertain, cries of peasants as they gain their freedom from the land. While life remains hard and poverty widespread, the absolute bondage of serfdom largely fades, replaced by various forms of tenancy or free labor. This doesn't mean that social injustice or poverty vanished. Far from it. But the fundamental legal and economic ties that bound peasants to the land and to a lord, defining their existence, were irrevocably broken. The relationship became more economic and less personal, more contractual and less hereditary. The very landscape begins to reflect this change. While castles remain, many are repurposed or fall into picturesque ruin. Grand royal palaces and bustling urban centers become the new symbols of power and prosperity. You feel the transition, a subtle but profound shift from a world dominated by fortified manners to one increasingly defined by thriving cities and national capitals. The end of feudalism wasn't a single event, but a complex, multifaceted process stretching over centuries. You have witnessed the slow erosion of its pillars, the agricultural base, the military structure, the economic system, the intellectual framework, and the spiritual authority that sustained it. It was a gradual unweaving of a social tapestry, thread by thread. You look back at the grand tapestry of the feudal age, witnessing its slow unraveling. The fragmentation of power, once held by numerous local lords, gradually concentrates into the hands of fewer, more powerful rulers. Absolute monarchies begin to solidify their grip, centralizing control over vast territories, often uniting disparate feudal domains under a single crown. You see the king, no longer merely the first among equals, but an unchallenged sovereign whose word is law. This new form of governance is starkly different from the contractual relationships of feudalism. The personal loyalties and mutual obligations between lord and vassal are replaced by a more impersonal, bureaucratic state apparatus. Armies are raised and funded by the crown, taxes are collected centrally, and justice is administered through royal courts, diminishing the power of local feudal jurisdictions. This consolidation of power is not without struggle. You witness the last vestiges of feudal resistance, as powerful nobles chafe under the tightening reins of royal authority. There are rebellions, coups, and civil wars, but ultimately, the trend toward centralization is inexorable. The growing wealth from trade, the professional armies, and the support of the burgeoning middle class empower the monarchs to crush dissent and establish undisputed dominion. The shift from a primarily agrarian economy to one increasingly dominated by commerce and early industry reshapes society profoundly. You feel the pulse of trade quickening, the clang of hammers in newly established workshops, and the hustle of growing port cities. Guilds, once powerful forces in urban centers, evolve and sometimes give way to new forms of production and labor organization. This emerging capitalism brings with it both immense opportunities and new forms of inequality. You see entrepreneurs amassing fortunes, investing in ventures, and creating wealth in ways unimaginable under the old feudal system. But you also witness the birth of a landless urban proletariat, workers who migrate from the countryside to seek wages in the cities, often living in squalor and subjected to new forms of exploitation. The philosophical and scientific advancements of this period further challenge the medieval worldview. You hear the names of Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, minds that dared to question the geocentric universe and unravel the laws of nature. Their discoveries, often met with resistance from established religious and academic institutions, usher in the scientific revolution. This era emphasizes observation, experimentation, and rational inquiry, shifting authority from tradition and dogma to empirical evidence. You feel the ground shifting beneath your feet as humanity's understanding of the universe expands, fundamentally altering its perception of its own place within it. The unchallenged authority of ancient texts and church doctrines, once the bedrock of thought, now faces rigorous intellectual scrutiny. The Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that follows, champions reason, individualism, and human rights. Thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire advocate for governments based on the consent of the governed, for freedom of speech, and for the separation of powers. You sense the seeds of modern democracy and republicanism being sown, concepts that are antithetical to the hierarchical and hereditary nature of feudalism. These ideas, revolutionary for their time, slowly begin to permeate society, influencing political thought and inspiring demands for greater freedoms and representation. You witness the increasing pressure on absolute monarchs, who, though powerful, now face a populace emboldened by new ideas about their inherent rights and the legitimacy of government. The very structure of land ownership and agricultural production undergoes further transformation. In some regions, the enclosure movement sees common lands privatized, leading to more efficient farming practices, but also displacing many small farmers and creating a surplus labor force for growing industries. Land, though still valuable, becomes more of a commodity to be bought and sold, rather than a fixed inheritance tied to feudal obligations. The old feudal concept of loyalty to a local lord gives way to a broader sense of national identity. You feel the burgeoning patriotism, the pride in a shared language, culture, and history that binds people not to a specific noble, but to a nation-state. Flags, anthems, and national narratives begin to replace heraldic banners and local allegiances as symbols of collective identity. This shift is reinforced by the growth of standardized legal systems and national currencies, which further integrate disparate regions into a unified whole. You perceive the creation of a common legal framework that applies to all subjects of the crown, gradually eroding the varied customary laws and privileges that characterized feudal territories. Ultimately, the decline of feudalism is not a neat, singular historical event, but a complex tapestry woven from 1,000 threads of change. It was an evolution driven by technological innovation in agriculture and warfare, demographic shifts from plague and growth, economic transformation from barter to money, to nascent capitalism, intellectual reawakening, spiritual upheaval, and the relentless centralization of political power. You have witnessed the world transform from a fragmented landscape of localized power and rigid social hierarchy to one on the cusp of modernity, characterized by powerful nation-states, global commerce, and the burgeoning belief in individual liberty and reason. The heavy, unyielding chain of feudalism, once thought unbreakable, has been meticulously dismantled, link by link. The world you now inhabit, with its complex economies, diverse political systems, and emphasis on individual agency, is a direct descendant of the forces that dismantled the feudal order. The echoes of that profound shift still resonate, reminding us that even the most deeply entrenched systems are subject to the relentless march of human innovation, ambition, and the unpredictable tides of history. So you stand here now on the threshold of a new era, looking back at the long winding road that led from the Lord's manor to the bustling city from the knight's sword, to the cannon's roar from unquestioning faith, to the dawn of reason. The end of feudalism was not just the end of a system, it was the birth of a world,